Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the work that I've done in East Africa with the Kubifora Field Project. We've been talking about the origins of agriculture and how people domesticated plants and used them. But today we're going to talk about my research that focuses on the transition from hunting and gathering to pastoralism. We've talked about the site of Kubifora before and the research that's been done in that region, but today, I'm going to talk specifically about the work that I've been doing that has been focusing on the Holocene period and when people started to use domesticated animals. Now, remember, the beginnings of agriculture and farming are particularly important because the products of agriculture are scalable and storable. You can grow more and you can store the products of your labor. And if you can do that, then you can sell the products of your labor, or you can do other things, do other tasks, and have other jobs and purchase the food that you need. The same thing is true with domesticated animals. You can scale up your herds, you can breed more animals, you can move them to areas with better forage, you can do things to improve the health and safety of your animals. And it's it's storable, sort of. The products of pastoralism are not quite as storable as, say, grains, for example, but you can store meat on the hoof. You can keep your herds alive until you're ready to butcher them. You can sell them live to people who might want to raise animals or might want to butcher them themselves. And the products of pastoralism, particularly milk and milk products and blood, many people drink the blood of their animals. Um, in East Africa, it's an important food source and very nutritious. So you can use the products of your animals without harming them. Think about, if you have chickens, you can harvest the eggs, and the chickens are perfectly happy with that. So pastoralism is also an important way in which people in the past controlled their food sources. So let me share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started with this. All right, here we go. So the beginnings of pastoralism in Africa is the main thing that we're talking about here. This is just my title slide. Let me move on. So for about 8 field seasons, I worked with the Kubifora Field School, which was working on the northeastern shore of Lake Turkana, just south of the Ethiopian border. So on this slide, you can see the country outlines. The arrow is pointing at the area approximately where Kubifora is located. Now, the reason I was working there, so the Kubifora Field Project is a much, much larger project, looking at everything from evidence of human evolution, excavating at the Ilaret footprint site, for example, as well as everything up through relatively recent times, the last few thousand years. And I'm looking at when pastoralism arrived in the area. And this happened between about 3,500 and 6,000 years ago, with the oldest sites and the oldest dates from work at a site called Dongodian and a site called the Stone Bowl site, both of which I was doing a lot of research on. And as part of a larger research question, which is the manner by which pastoralism arrived. So pastoralism, people starting to use domesticated animals, and we're talking about cattle, which are the really important ones, goats, sheep, donkeys, and much later, people are using camels much more recently. So the idea is, and research has shown, that pastoralism first appears in North Africa very early, like 9,000 years ago, maybe 10,000 years ago. And it sort of sweeps to the south. So the oldest pastoralist sites are in the north of Africa. The most recent pastoralist sites and the earliest or the most recent origins of pastoralist is in South Africa. So the question has always been, is it new people bringing domesticated animals in, and these new people just migrate from north to south? Or is it the exchange of ideas? Is it new people with these animals moving from north to south? Or is it just the idea and people are trading for animals, but they're otherwise living in the same places they were living before? Is it, people who were hunter gatherers just start using domesticated animals? So My contribution to this larger research question, is asking the question, can we see changes in stone tool material use, particularly obsidian, across this transition to pastoralism that could indicate whether or not it's migration of new people? So if new people are moving in, I would expect a radical change in the obsidian sources, the stone tool sources that are represented in the archaeological record. New people bring new knowledge of obsidian quarries and obsidian sources. They may continue to have trading networks with people in their original homeland. Um, and they might continue to use uh, the homeland sources and the homeland resources until they learn their new landscape. And this kind of pattern has been documented elsewhere with the movement of hunter-gatherers into new territories. They continue to use resources from their homeland for a while before they learn their new landscape. If it's a shift in the subsistence strategy of existing people, just new ideas moving in, we may see a minor change in stone tool material use with changes in mobility based on this new economy, but we're unlikely to see a radical change in the kind and number of sources of stone represented. We would expect they would continue to use their local resources and continue to use their local trade networks. So new people means big change. Existing people, probably little change. Now, the site of Kubifora was made famous by the Leakeys. You've heard about this place before, who founded a research camp there in the late 1960s. Richard Leakey was the founder of this research camp. And up through the 1970s, a series of very important hominin finds were made there, including Homo habilis, for which this Kubifora area is most well known. I was affiliated with the Kubifora Field Project as a senior research scientist and brought expertise in archaeological field and lab methods, specifically focusing on more recent finds within the Holocene. Now, as you know, the Holocene is about the last 10,000 years. So I was looking at these more recent sites. However, the project as a whole is still working to excavate fossil hominins and has found, for example, an arm fragment dating to about 1.5 million years ago, probably of Homo erectus, some teeth, and most famously, the Illoret footprint site that we've talked about before. Now, where I've been working is in an area on the landscape that's about 55 meters above the current lake levels. And lake levels can be used as a rough estimate for chronology, and I'll talk about why. So the circle on this map marks the approximate area where I've been working. Now, the whole landscape is very arid. It's very desert-like, but there are a series of dry riverbeds that will flow during the rainy season. So what you're looking at here is the Illoret River. It's dry now, but during the rainy season, there's water that flows. And what's also important is that people today get fresh water by digging wells within this dry riverbed. And these are shallow water holes that they will dig. They might be 5 or 6 feet deep, not terribly deep. But you can't drink the water in Lake Turkana. It's very alkali. It would be like drinking the ocean. So you can't drink that water. So you need another source of fresh water. Where these dry riverbeds enter into Lake Turkana, the groundwater, even during the driest part of the dry season, the groundwater is not too terribly deep below the ground surface. So if you dig in certain areas, you can form a water hole, you can create a small well, and you can use that water for your own drinking water as well as for your animals. So people in the present who are modern pastoralists and people in the past chose to live along these dry riverbeds, which sometimes have water, and chose to live kind of near the lake shore. But Lake Turkana has been dropping. So today, direct precipitation on the lake is about 200 to 500 millimeters a year. This isn't a whole lot of rain. And the rain is actually exceeded by the evaporation rate. So more water evaporates out of the lake than falls as rain. Groundwater sort of flows in. I told you about how groundwater is not too terribly deep below these dry rivers, but doesn't make for a significant inflow into Lake Turkana. Really, the only main source of fresh water into Lake Turkana comes from the Omo River, which flows south out of Ethiopia, um, and which has its sources up in the Ethiopian highlands. Now, the Omo River is also being manipulated by the Ethiopian government, which has built a series of dams for hydroelectric power and for irrigation. So the Omo River doesn't flow as it once used to. But what you're looking at here is a chart of how Lake Turkana has been dropping over the last 10,000 years. Its highest point was 80 meters above the current lake level. And it can't get higher than that, because if it gets higher than that, then the water spills over into the Nile basin and will flow north into the Nile River system. So it can't get too much higher, but it does drop. And there was a period between about 4,000 and 6,000 years ago when the lake stood at about 55 meters above the current lake level. And at that point, that's the point at which pastoralism was introduced to this area. Now, I'll show you why that's important. This is just a picture of the Omo River. I took this picture when we had visited the village of Omarate in Ethiopia, and the river was at flood stage at that point. So there had recently been a lot of rain up in the Ethiopian highlands, and the river was very flooded. It doesn't usually look this big. But this is an interesting slide. So I took this picture out the window of a little bush plane that was taking me to Kubifora one year. And the plane was flying fairly low, so I got a good picture. So what you're looking at here is I'm looking down out the plane window, and you can see a whole series of lines along that beach. These are old remnant beaches. On the ground, these dropping lake levels aren't really all that visible. But when you look from above, you can see all of the old remnant beaches as the lake level has been dropping. Now, this can really be important for approximating the time of occupation, as local people in the past, just like in the present, often chose to live near the lakeshore. So a lake stand about 55 meters above current lake levels is associated with that transition to pastoralism. So what we do as archaeologists is we go out and we have our GPS so we can figure out our elevation, and we conduct archaeological surveys in areas that are kind of the right height above the lake level. And the modern people that live in the region are Dasanich. And I thought I had that written out on the slide, but that's spelled Dassanetch. So these are pastoralists who have goats and sheep and donkeys and some cattle. And they also supplement their diet with wild foods, as well as a little bit of farming kind of right down near the Omo River Delta. And they farm millet in particular. Today, they are also buying some foodstuffs and receive some government subsidies of some other grains to get them through periods of shortage. But we use these modern people as a model for those of prehistoric pastoralists because they are still out on the landscape with their animals, just like prehistoric people were. Now, one thing that's sort of interesting is the Dasanich say they rarely eat their livestock. Animals are milked, goats are milked, cattle are milked, and they're bled, but they're rarely killed for meat. That usually only happens in a special occasion. This is what their communities look like. This is a small boma, and it has several houses. You can see a thorn fence around it. What you see underneath that tree, that shade, is an animal hide that's been stretched out to dry. They rarely eat their animals, but when we're in the field, we will sometimes buy a goat from the local herders and butcher that for our dinner. So when we do that, we often give the hide back to whoever owned the goat that we bought it from. And so they'll stretch it and scrape it and then hang it up over a smoky fire so it'll cure. So this is what these little communities look like. And usually this will be a man and multiple wives, and each of the wives will have her own house, usually. Sometimes, if she doesn't have children, she might share a house, but oftentimes it's a woman and her children, and the woman will own the house, and the husband might move between the different houses. If you ask the local women, they'll say it depends on whether or not they're mad at him at that moment. Now, inside these houses are actually very comfortable. So the environment there is very hot, very dry, but the houses are constructed in such a way that they get a nice little breeze blowing through them. And if you sit inside, it's very comfortable, even in the hottest part of the day. In this picture, you're looking at the man who's sitting in the middle. His name was Twala, and Twala was a wealthy man in the Dasanich community. The man in the blue shirt, sitting to Twala's right, his name was Joshua, and he worked a lot with us in the field and also was a fairly good translator. His English was pretty good. And then the man on the other side, he was basically Twala's assistant, and I don't know if they were related, but he helped Twala in a lot of his dealings. Now, young men in the community, and the one on the right in this picture had just completed his puberty ceremony and was considered a man. These young men will work very hard to accumulate goats and cows so that they can marry, because it's very important for them to have enough cattle in particular, and goats, that they can pay the bride price so that they can ask a girl to marry them, or ask her family if they can marry. You see the younger, I can't call him a boy because at this point he had already gone through his puberty ceremony, so he's considered a man. But the younger man in this picture, what he's holding is a throwing stick that the Dasanich call a chara. And the chara functions sort of like a boomerang. The boys will use it to hunt small animals like rabbits, for example. Now, back to hunting and gathering and pastoralism. So prior to the transition to pastoralism, people were hunter-gatherers, and fishing was very significant. In the archaeological record, we often find bone harpoons, which is what you're looking at here. Bone harpoons are common on archaeological sites older than about 6,000 years, but less common and often completely absent on more recent sites. Probably people were still doing some fishing, but they might have been using nets, for example. We do sometimes find fish bone in archaeological sites. Now, today, fishing is not really considered a high-class activity amongst the Dasanich, although there's been some changes to that. So usually today, if a Dasanich is a fisherman, it's because he's for some reason lost his animals. He's lost his cattle. They've been stolen, they've died, something has happened, and he no longer has his wealth in the form of cattle and goats. So someone might fish for a year or so and try to save up money so that they can purchase some animals and start their herds again. Now, what you're looking at here, these are tilapia that have been caught from Lake Turkana using a net, and then they're split open and dried. And then after this, they would be loaded on a donkey and walked up into Ethiopia and sold there. However, more recently, some enterprising individual in Nairobi figured out that if you could get a refrigerated truck up to the shore of Lake Turkana in this area and could load up with fish fast enough and drive them back to Nairobi fast enough before they started to spoil, that you could sell them for a major markup. So this has actually changed the economy a little bit. And in this area now, you do have some people who are fishermen by choice, not because they had to be, because they can earn very quick cash for fishing. But the sites that I was interested in are sites at this 55-meter level, right, marking the transition to pastoralism, and sites that contained obsidian. I was particularly interested in obsidian artifacts that I found on these sites. And the reason for that is that obsidian can be analyzed and we can match that back to the geologic source that it came from using a technique called X-ray fluorescence spectrometry. And this is where my expertise came in. So as you're looking at this site, at this map, on the left, you can see Lake Turkana. On the right, you see some little icons that represent obsidian sources. Obsidian is a volcanic rock, so these are old volcanoes that produced obsidian. And then the sites that you're looking at here, FWJJ 27, FWJJ 5, 25, and 26, these are the archaeological sites we were excavating. And remember, people chose to live kind of near the lakeshore. You can't drink Lake Turkana water. You couldn't 5,000 years ago either. But the groundwater level in these dry riverbeds is highest as you get closer and closer to the lake. And if you dig, you can reach fresh water in 5 or 6 feet, depending on where you are. So what you're looking at in this picture is a woman and her children around one of these water holes, one of these small wells that she dug, and she's collecting water for her family. They surround it with a thorn fence so that wild animals and their own animals don't fall in the hole. And this is what those holes look like. So in this one, it was pretty deep, so someone stuck a ladder in it so that you can climb down and fill up your jug with water. So the work that I was doing there was part of a field program, initially a partnership between the National Museums of Kenya and Rutgers University, and then it transitioned to be a partnership with George Washington University. The projects are still ongoing. We do take students with us, so students have the opportunity to join the field school and work on excavations. So this was us excavating in the field, 2 of the students, and some of the things that we find. So in this picture, at the top, next to my little scale, you see a piece of black stone. That's obsidian. To the right of that is a piece of jasper. That's like a chert, like a cryptocrystalline silicate. Right under the ruler, you see something. That's actually an ostrich eggshell. I'll show you what that was used for in just a minute. And at the bottom, you can see 2 rows of pottery. Prehistoric pottery was pretty common. So ostrich eggshell was used in beads. So the ostrich eggshell would have been collected. It would have been shaped into these round beads. And we find these beads on archaeological sites. And people today still make and use them. So one of the things I was looking at was the suite of artifacts that we find. Ostrich eggshell beads, small expedient stone tools, and an increased use of obsidian with the beginnings of pastoralism. So who were the people living near Lake Turkana during this time? One of the sites that we worked on, FWJJ 27, that is the National Museums of Kenya designation. At this site, we excavated to recover some human remains that were actively eroding into a runoff channel. And we worked with Dr. Emma Mbua from the National Museums of Kenya. She was a partner on this and recommended recovery and documentation of these remains because it was clear they were unlikely to last another rainy season without stabilization. So as you're looking at this picture in the foreground, you can see some human remains that had eroded out. And this is a close-up of the skeleton as it was eroding out. You can see a fragment of the hip, the innominate, and some small bone fragments on the surface. So the site appeared to be about 4,000 years old based on its elevation above current lake levels. So it places it right in the middle of this transitional time that we were so interested in. Also, if you look at this picture, if you look closely, you can see a lot of shell. So these small shells mark where the lakeshore was. And, they are a really good marker of where the lakeshore was during this time, and about 4,000 years ago. Dr. Mbua is in this picture. She's in the foreground. She's the woman with the hat pushed back. So she worked with us in the field. However, we have a very limited recovery of other artifacts from this site. This what will probably be a place where we keep going back to for additional excavations. And with the skeleton, we only had time to stabilize and recover the skeleton, but not really time to put in other test excavations. But Dr. Mbua was also excited about the potential for stable isotope studies on the skeleton. And if you remember, if you look at stable isotope ratios, we can get a good understanding of what people were eating during this time. And this is just a close-up of the skeleton. It was buried in a flexed position, and the hand was kind of over the face like this. Modern Dasanich people bury their dead in these kinds of low mounds. That's what you're looking at here in the foreground. That's a grave. And the body is also placed in a flexed position and covered with soil and rock. They generally don't dig down for a grave. The soil is very rocky. You hit stone pretty quickly. So instead, rock is mounded over the dead instead. Now, another interesting thing that we found at the site was a hearth. So this was someone's fireplace within their house. And it included some charcoal stained soil that we collected for some dating, since there's probably enough, in particular AMS dating, probably wasn't enough for traditional carbon-14 dating. But more interestingly, for what I was working on, were two small flakes that were actually used as scraping tools. There's evidence of use wear on them, made of obsidian. And I also analyzed obsidian from FWJJ25, another one of these sites from the map that I showed you, and from FWJJ5. So we recovered a range of prehistoric materials, but a large portion of the stone tool assemblage was obsidian. And so we collected all of these, and it's an older picture of me, but permission was obtained from the National Museums to bring the obsidian artifacts to the US for analysis. Now, today, here at Coastal, we have an X-ray fluorescent spectrometer that is a portable model. So we use that in classes and student research, and I take that into the field. But at the time, I didn't have access to that equipment. So these artifacts were analyzed at the X-ray fluorescence laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, and the XRF lab that was at the time run by Dr. M. Stephen Shackley. So X-ray fluorescence is or XRF, we call it XRF, is a geochemical technique, a characterization technique. In other words, it allows us to determine the elemental composition of a sample, in this case, obsidian. And we pay particular attention to the quantities of elements like strontium, rubidium, yttrium, and zirconium. So the analysis gives us the elemental composition of these samples. But it's not just that we understand what the sample is made of or what its components are. Instead, the reason it's important is because we can then source samples. So this is done by matching the chemical signature of an archaeological artifact, like one of those obsidian flakes that you saw, to a known source of obsidian. So volcanoes, obsidian's unique. So they're volcanic rock. And when volcanoes erupt, they have a unique chemical makeup that is different for different volcanoes. And the chemical signature of each volcano is the result of magma evolution and basically things that are dissolved in the molten rock under the volcano. And it differs from volcano to volcano. So when that volcano erupts, the stone that is formed from that lava basically freezes that chemical signature. And since it's unique for each volcano, we can determine what that signature is. And if we find things made of stone that look similar to it, we can analyze its chemical makeup and see if it's a match. Now, what you're looking at here, these are the results of X-ray fluorescence. And the red box outlines the elements that I was particularly interested in. The reason these elements are important is because they don't really decompose within a sample. They vary between volcanoes, but not within a volcano. So they're particularly useful. This is one of the volcanoes that the obsidian could have come from. This is the Shin volcano off in the distance. Some of the other volcanoes I was looking at aren't so pretty. They're not really a mountain sticking up off the earth. They're more of a flatter mound, for example. So what I do with the data that I have is I then plot it and compare it to some of my known volcanoes. So what you're looking at in this image, and I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but I'll try, but I'll talk through it too. So down at the bottom, you see the blue dot represents the Surghai source. This is one obsidian forming volcano. The yellow dot represents the Shin volcano. And then on this plot, this graph that you can see where I've plotted the yellow and the blue, the Shin and the Surghai, and these are the signatures of the known volcanoes, right? So the yellow and the blue represents my samples from the known sources. The little blue diamonds represent artifacts that I have analyzed. And if you look at this, you can see there's really three clusters of artifacts, of artifact chemistries. One is a pretty good match with the Shin volcano. One is a pretty good match with the Surghai volcano. And then one is a bunch of artifacts that are coming from someplace that I don't know where they're coming from. Now, when you look at this map again, you can see Surghai and Shin are the two most well-known volcanoes in the area, but there are, in fact, others. There's actually one on an island out in Lake Turkana, which if people were collecting obsidian from there, means they must have had boats, because this island was always an island in the past. Lake levels were actually higher, not lower. And in one study that I partnered with Dr. Emmanuel Ndiema from the National Museums of Kenya, we have some pieces that we think came from that island. So we're able to document that people were using boats about 6,000 years ago to collect obsidian. But the reason why we do this is because it can tell us a little bit about how people were moving around on the landscape and who they might have been trading with. So remember, if you go back to the question that I had asked, if we see no change in the patterns of obsidian use and other resource use across the transition to pastoralism, I interpret that to mean that it's just an idea moving in, that people are trading for goats and cattle, and it's not a migration of people. If we see a complete change in the kinds of materials people are using, I would suggest that represents a new population moving in. And what we actually find is that all of the other patterns, for the most part, stay the same as people start practicing pastoralism. They're not radically changing their trade networks. They're not radically changing their other technologies. These things change slowly, but not at the immediate transition to pastoralism. So this tells me that it's a new idea moving in. And what's interesting about it, so I took this picture. We never used to see camels in Dawsonage territory. They were very rare. And over the years, we started to see more and more people start using camels, but they didn't really change anything else about their way of life. So it suggests to me that even people today are adopting new things, new animals, new forms of pastoralism without new people moving in. And it provides a really good model of what was happening in the past. And that's what I have for you today. So let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk more about what these kinds of changes meant for new civilizations in the past.